How are you? So, big shout out to Joe and Amanda for having such a diverse group here today. Diverse enough to have a Luddite like me on stage. I spent my career as a macroeconomic investor. And what macroeconomic investors do is we try to kind of take complicated things and make them simple enough to boil down for us to invest in. And so, broadly, it's been one where you're looking at countries and big trends, inflation, growth in countries, and investing in fixed income markets, currency markets, equity markets, commodity markets. The other word for macroeconomic investor is speculator. Sometimes it has a bad word, but when you're a speculator, you spend a lot of time looking at bubbles. You spend a lot of time understanding the psychology of investing. And I'm going to spend some of my time today talking about that. When I first started public speaking, I was really, really bad at it. And I had a friend that said, before you get on stage, think about how you can serve the audience. And the moment you think about how you can serve the audience, then it's about them, not you, and you're not nervous. And so I thought about how to serve today. And so I'm going to spend a decent amount of time at the end taking questions because you're a strange audience for me. I'm used to speaking in front of audiences of traditional investors, people that have all had the same kind of canon of knowledge going into the day. But this is a diverse new space. There are some people I'm sure that haven't invested, but a lot of you guys are part of this giant growing community and part of this movement. And so you know a heck of a lot more about this than me. I thought I'd hit on a few things. A, how I got involved in the blockchain and Bitcoin and Ethereum space. B, how I approach the space. What's my investment thesis? C, talk a little bit about, are we in a bubble or not? And what does that actually mean? And then D, how do I see the future? And, what are the parameters I'm going to use to both make investments and get excited? I'll try to leave you with a little bit of optimism. This has been a pretty optimistic day. So, like the introduction said, I was at Fortress Investments. I got a call from a friend. And he said, hey, I have heard about this thing, Bitcoin, and I hadn't, so I Googled it. And, I started doing a little bit of homework in it. And as a currency investor, it attracted me because Bitcoin was a currency, right? And so we looked at it, and it was trading at about 100, and real quickly decided it was worth a little bit of investigation. And didn't know if the long-term prospects would work, but understand a few things. That there were enough anti-government, anarchists, libertarians out there that were going to buy in, that there were enough people in the developing countries that were looking for safety that could buy in, and that at that point there was still an insecurity around our own monetary policy in the developed world. And so we thought, we don't know if it'll work in the long run, but damn it, this has got the markings of a bubble. People are going to buy this and it's going to go a lot higher. And so we bought a bunch and started investing. And like most things in investing, when things start going your way and you start making money, you dig in a little deeper. Because you're like, geez, it's never that easy. And so we started digging in and getting more and more excited. Made some venture investments. I either prophetically or absentmindedly made a big proclamation that Bitcoin would go to 1,000 when it was trading about 150, and it went to 1,000. And so for a moment, everyone thought I was very smart. It went, shortly back to 250, and people forgot about me. And quite frankly, we lost a lot of enthusiasm in the space because it went sideways. And then I was lucky enough I didn't get fired from my job. I left my job, but I didn't leave in the most graceful of ways. And, when you're recovering, you look at your portfolio, and I said, what am I going to do with these investments? And so the one guy I knew that knew a lot about this stuff was Joe Lubin, so I called him and came over here to ConsenSys in Bushwick, and I expected to find my old college pal, his dog, and two analysts. And instead I found this very dynamic community of not just young programmers, but even guys my age, people from the business world, people from programming, coding, and I started thinking, something's on here. And it took Joe about 30 minutes of giving me the Ethereum pitch, to get me to buy in. When I think about the overall value proposition to this space, one number hits me, that there's 65,000 people have downloaded the Ethereum, the ConsenSys development apps. And so I thought, not just the 50 people that worked for Joe at that point, but 65,000 people around the ecosystem are working on this project. And so I started developing my own investment thesis that these things aren't digital currencies at all, that you need to think them as digital equities. And that, for me, they're digital equities with massive workforces that we're getting for free. Because the way I think about it is, each time a transaction happens in the Ethereum space, right, you're using a little bit of Ethereum fuel to fuel that transaction. And so the value of Ethereum should be some rough calculation of the net present value of discounted of future cash flows. Those cash flows are each transaction times a teeny bit of fuel. And so as you see adoption, and as you can imagine adoption going this way, you can see valuation going. And so it was a really easy bet when I walked into Joe's office and the total market cap of Ethereum was $80 million. It's a harder bet today at a $12 or $13 million market cap. But I often think AutoZone, a company that sells and fixes combustion engines, is still trading close to a $30 billion market cap. And so when you step back from a second and you look at the broader picture, the total market cap of the ConsenSys ecosystem still is very, very low relative to other companies that we don't think of as game changers. Now, when I think of the ecosystem as of the entire space, and I add all the ECOs in Ripple and Bitcoin together, we're getting on $100 billion. And I think that's relatively significant. It means a few things. It means one thing, regulation is coming, right? When you're a small experiment, people don't really care that much about you. But when you start hitting $100 billion market caps, and people start making and losing real money, the regulators are going to perk up very fast. Two, I'd give everyone one cheap piece of advice, because I know the community started in this kind of anti-government, libertarian, deep-seated space, is to pay your taxes. The tax man is coming. There are real fortunes that have now been made and maybe will be lost in this space. And so I'm fairly certain that the price move has grown up faster than the community has grown up. And so it's going to take a little bit of time to fill in that piece of it. But compliance, regulation, all of that's going to be needed around this space for it to have its long-term success. The question of are we in a bubble is an interesting one. So bubbles always happen around the same kind of things. They happen around things that become so inevitable, you're like, of course. The railroad bubble. Railroads are going to change the world. They did. The internet bubble. I remember in 1999, I bought a MP3 player because I was going to go on this long race in the Sahara. And they were like, that thing can hold 10 songs. I was like, no way. And so I listened to the same 10 songs for 7 straight days. But it was really relatively cool because it was so new. When I bought the thing, the salesman said, in 10 years, you'll be able to buy one of these. It'll have every song ever recorded on it. And I was like, no way. And when I think about it, the promise of the internet, what we believed in the internet in 1997, 98, 99, we've far outstripped it, right? The internet is so much more ubiquitous in our life now than we were dreaming it could be in 97, 98, 99. Yet, many of those companies never got back to those prices. So bubbles happen on things that are going to happen. And so this is going to be a giant bubble. Why? Because this experiment, this idea, distributed everything. First in blockchain, then first in Bitcoin, then in Ethereum, and now in this broader blockchain movement, has gone from, I think, experimentation to implementation. And so as this is going to happen, prices are moving, and you can see it right now. And so I'm certain we're going to be in a bubble, and that we're in the bubble at this point. Now, great fortunes are made in trend. Who in this room bought Ether under $10. And who still has all the Ether they bought? Every hand goes down almost except 3. So what's hard about this is these are really venture investments, but there's liquidity in them, so you can sell. The hardest thing to do is to stay in trend. We used to say you got to handcuff yourself to the seat. And so if it was a venture investment, if it was Facebook, you put your money in Facebook like smart old Peter Thiel, he sold all of his on the IPO. You know, the moment there was liquidity, boom, get me out. Would have made a whole lot of money if he'd stayed in trend. It's hard to stay in trend. So one of my cheap pieces of advice is, in the companies that you really think are game changers, stay in trend. There are going to be pets.coms in this space. I've seen a bunch of them already. And there are going to be Google's system changers and Amazon's. When I look at Amazon went from 1 to 120, then it kind of went back to 10, and then it went to 900. And so it took 15 years for once it got back to 100 to get to 900. And so don't fool yourself. The law of large numbers works. Now that these companies have big market caps, it's going to be a lot harder for them to move as fast. The money isn't going to be as easily made. But the good companies, you want to stay in. So bubbles. What else can I tell you about bubbles? There are some good benefits of them. And I think part of what's happening in this community right now is great. That there's money being poured in to the development in lots of these new businesses where there's real money that are going to give people time to build out the infrastructure necessary, right? Starting a new project, venture people are always begging for small amounts of money, and now there's real money here. So there's a real opportunity to have some of these ideas on stage, come to fruition at a much faster pace than would have been a few years ago. And so I think that's all a net positive. For this to really work, though, we need to have the bigger story. And I think what's interesting about this, for me, is there's a deeper story than just the back of the TV. I try to explain this to my mother, and when you talk about databases, no one really gets that excited. Distributed databases, they don't really get excited either. And most of the applications that we're hearing about and seeing really are just adding efficiency to a system. So even all the great ledger work that banks are going to work on, as a customer of the bank, maybe your fees go down a little bit. You're not going to notice it per se. People that get fired at the banks are going to notice it, as efficiency comes to those jobs and we cut out whole levels of bureaucracy. But that's not going to catch the imagination. I think the interesting story and the bigger story than is being told out there in the mainstream press is that this can be a very disruptive technology when it comes to pricing things that we don't price. So are we going to start exchanging goods and services in Ether or Medium or Bitcoin? No, we're not. These aren't digital currencies. And the reason is currencies need stability, right? Ether's gone from 1 to 130. That's not stable. That's awesome if you own it, but it's not stable. Even Bitcoin this year has almost doubled, or it has doubled. That's not stable. But what's interesting is, at one point, our data, our personal data, our biometric data, the data of our actions, the data that we see on our likes on Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp, our brain data, if Elon Musk has his way and he can connect into our brains, all of that could potentially be on the blockchain and be monetized. And that's interesting because if you can take your individual data back, it's a source of wealth. And I think the big story for the story that'll get people excited about is once they can start seeing that, because it fits in with the societal problem we're having, right? The start of the internet really accelerated the gap between rich and poor, both here in the US and all around the world, right? So we have this tiny funnel at the top that's making all the money. At one point, two things happen. There's more redistribution or there's revolution. And so we're going to have redistribution. And this could be one of the most elegant ways of redistribution of money that's out there, right? I've been studying a lot about UBI, right? Universal Basic Income. I honestly believe that it's a version of that is almost guaranteed to happen in the next 30 years, 15 years, 20, 10 years. But maybe if individual citizens start getting compensated for their data, for what they're doing, it's just a better way, at least at part of that redistribution. And so to me, that's the best of the optimistic stories of Ethereum and blockchain. I do think, be careful out there. Having watched markets and bubbles my whole life, we're in a short-term frenzy. It will shock me if it just keeps going the way it's going without some major pullbacks. There were 70% corrections in Amazon on its way up here, and so there are going to be big corrections in this space. Manage your enthusiasm and your DNA, your testosterone wisely, because you can tell even with the vibrancy here, there's something very powerful happening, but that translates into markets sometimes too fast. And with that, I'm going to stop, because I said I'd leave 5 minutes for questions, and I only have 4 left. So thank you, and any questions? Got to have one question. There you go. Well, listen, I don't know if any of you have been to Venezuela, but before this revolution in Venezuela, when it was, quote, nicer, the wealthy families lived with literally barricades around them, with bodyguards. And, at one point, we can decide, we can go back to an aristocratic society with castles and moats, or we can kind of push towards something more egalitarian. And it feels like part of the DNA of this country is having some middle class. We're having a really hard time getting there. Like, we had Obama. He said, I'm going to be the redistributionist president. And by the end of his 8 years, with having instituted Obamacare, putting a 3.9% surcharge on everybody for Medicare, for Obamacare, with raising the top tax rates 5-6%, all of that, the rich-poor gap just kept going one direction. So, this is a hard thing to change because it's happening from technology and it's happening from this kind of global labor arbitrage. But at one point, I think this Trump revolution, it could have been a Sanders revolution, is the world recognizing that, or the US recognizing that the last 30 years left 65-70% of America behind. 60% of America doesn't have $1,000 of savings. So guess what? Those 60% of people didn't buy one share of Ether because they didn't have the money to. So they don't get to participate in this movement. And so I honestly think we're getting there very quickly. We got there before the Age of Ultron started, right? Every conference you go to talks about how AI and machine-based learning is coming and coming fast. And so we need to start imagining a world where people do less, not more. And that has to have some redistribution in it. And so this, I think, could be kind of a very crafty way to re-empower the individual.
So my question is, I don't know if it's open information. How much you invested in blockchain? How much you are ready to invest? Are you ready to invest more? And in what kind of project you will invest?
So I'll take it backwards. We're looking at lots of projects, and I want to invest in the ones that are going to win. We're looking at projects that we think really can have a sustainable long-term purpose, right? There has to be a value proposition in a project that you invest in. And I think some that we're seeing do, and some that don't. Listen, valuation's tough right now because the ECO market makes everyone so excited. You're getting white papers with an okay, not even a dynamic team, and they're taking them to the ECO market and getting valuations. So I think you got to be careful, but we're looking for dynamic CEOs and business plans with real value proposition. Think about Amazon. His original business pivoted, and so much relies around the CEO that you're investing in. I said publicly recently that I have over 10% of my net worth in this space. That's when Bitcoin was 1,200. I did say Bitcoin was going to 2,000, hit there today, so I feel you can check the box on that one. And I think Ether was about half the price. So now I have more than 10% of my net worth invested in the space. I didn't say that I started with a much smaller fraction of that. This has probably been the best macro trade of my career. And so I got to thank Joe for that. Because if I didn't know him, I wouldn't be in Ether. But it's been an exciting run. And one thing that leaves me some confidence, listen, I think there will be a pullback at one point. Markets consolidate. They just don't grow to the sky. One thing that gives me confidence, though, to have a core position that I'm going to keep is that not one of my friends from the hedge fund world, you know, the big giant macro or long short equity investors that you read about in the paper, I don't know one that's got a significant holding in this stuff. And bubbles don't end until they buy. It's true. And so one way, like this community all owns something, but you need, you know, the Fidelities. Like this is going to be one of the great bubbles. And one reason is that we have the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians, you know, the Mideast. This is a global market. And while the NASDAQ was quasi-global market on an institutional basis, this is a global market that lets the little man in everywhere. And so it really does have the capacity to be one of the all-time bubbles. And again, I don't use bubble in a pejorative term because I think bubbles happen around transformational technologies. They happen around stories that usually change the world. And so I do think this is one of them.
So you mentioned that there's a pending regulatory framework that's coming, and I just want to get your thoughts on what shape you think that might take and how regulatory capacity is fit in as well.
So, you know, the great thing about macro, guys, is we talk a lot of platitudes, and there's often not so much detail beyond that. I haven't done enough research on what regulation is coming. I just know intuitively that we've gone from a small community that was less significant and some big ideas to a community that's got $100 billion of market cap. And when people start losing money, and people will lose money in this space, that's when regulators show up. The first ECO that goes back to zero, that's done on a big scale. And this stuff, you know, people are breaking, people are making new inroads in framework, right? Brock Peterson's ICO of blockchain capital, selling a security into the United States. You know, courageous, did a lot of work on it, you know, a lot of legal opinions, and, you know, we'll see. But that's all new ground, and hopefully the regulators continue to work with this system. But I just know my instinct is as soon as people start losing, there'll be more regulatory framework. Okay, last question.
Do you have any recommendations for amateur macro enthusiasts where to start learning about the lines, cycles, bubbles, how you kind of stick your head into?
Yeah, there's a great book called The Madness of, oh God, what is it? The Madness of Crowds. Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. I mean, that's kind of the Bible of bubbles. There's another book called Reminiscence of a Stock Operator. Guys, thank you very much, and good luck.